Hi, I'm Christian Williams. This is a video of 4 Bermuda races in early offshore trimarans. It's a return to 1968 and a celebration of the figures of the time. Yacht design and sailors were moving rapidly on, and everything seemed possible. And it was, although in the end, they left me behind to guard the old-fashioned traditions. The film is Super 8mm remastered from a version I published 10 years ago. And if I seem younger, well, that's an optical illusion. On film, we remain as we are.
By the late 1960s, we'd had lots of boats. They went by in the blink of an eye. We'd grown up with them. We'd learned all about them. Centerboard boats and then keel boats. Why a keel? Well, something had to oppose the force of the wind on the sails when the boat heeled over to make sure it didn't just lie on its side. They were beautiful boats, heavy, and if you did everything right and trimmed the sails perfectly, why, they could go 6 knots. The Polynesians had a much different idea, an idea that might even be 4,000 years old. Since their boats were canoes and couldn't support a heavy-lead keel, they used an outrigger, which they called an ama. If you put an ama on a canoe, it went very fast. It wasn't weighed down by lead. Put on 2 amas and you had a trimaran. My father said he had to have one. So he commissioned the naval architect Richard C. Newark, who was a very well-known pioneer in trimaran design, to design him one. And Paul Wentworth in Maine built it, and my father called it Try Me. It was 1968. The world was changing. Boats were changing, and I think Manley, Cadwallader, or Williams just wanted to keep up and go fast, and he wanted to race them. There were only a few of these boats around, but in Coney Island in 1969, the first multi-hull Bermuda race took place. Well, we took off with high hopes. That's Rhodey Siegler, who was the girlfriend of another naval architect, Robert Harris, and the 4 of us got on Try Me, went to the starting line and blasted off for Bermuda. The boats were light and fast. We had no electronics whatsoever. Too much weight, and besides, hey, it was only 1969. We had only an outboard for power. Our light was kerosenes. We had no ice. The beer got warm after a few days. Hey, that's fine. It sailed fast. We'd never seen anything like this. Speeds up to 20 knots. It made for a bouncy, wet ride. Rhodey was a good crew member to be on board with. I'd actually never sailed with a woman before. So when we got in the Gulf Stream and some heavy seas, naturally I puked my guts out and spewed stuff from the other end as well. Used 2 buckets and got through it quite nicely. Bit embarrassing, I'll say. This boat had taken a pretty good beating crossing the Gulf Stream. And when we were on the Bermuda side, where the winds usually are lighter in the Bermuda High, the water temperature was suddenly 85. The air temperature was 85. We were going 10 knots to windward. Had our direction finder on deck to listen to the first hint of where Bermuda might be across the ocean by homing in on its radio frequency. A beautiful time, really. Now, this boat was not experimental, but only the second of its kind ever built. It had a very sturdy and large rudder to keep us going in a straight line. This bit of mayhem is just moments after the rudder came off the boat entirely. A few drips of blood from my smashed finger, and suddenly we were 200 miles from Bermuda, 500 miles from the coast, with no rudder. You can see how the gudgeons pulled completely off the transom. Harris was a good guy, and he taught me a lot. Things break. There are always solutions. Don't give up. We'll get there. It took us several days, but we finally figured out a way to sail the boat using the sails when the wind was just right, without a rudder, to head in the general direction of Bermuda. We leaked some from the holes in the transom, but it wasn't much of a problem. I think it took us 2 or 3 days to get there, dead last in the race, limping in. And then I had the most marvelous experience of living aboard the boat in a slipway next to the Royal Hamilton Amateur Dinghy Club, while repairs, permanent repairs, were made to the rudder of our new boat. You can't imagine anything better than making coffee on a slipway. Now, the island we were headed for is that red dot on the map. It's 700 miles offshore from Newport or New York City in the North Atlantic Ocean. To get there, compass course 160 magnetic from Newport, across the Gulf Stream 160 miles out through the Sargasso Sea, enter at St. David's Head in the upper right-hand corner of the chart. Naturally, we had to do it again as soon as possible. This time my brother was on board. It was after Vietnam. His hair had grown some. This race started at Newport, where every yacht race should start from. Just arriving in Newport, past the mansions, is an extraordinary feeling of being a part of something extremely nautical. We'd made some changes to the boat, made sure we were light, made sure we were ready to go this time. And the quality of the fleet had improved considerably. There were many more boats, many new designs, all of them lighter and longer and sleeker and more uncomfortable than before, and faster. And the occasional Frenchman had already shown up. This boat was called Gulf Streamer. It was a Newark design of Mr. Phil Weld. It was a behemoth, 65 feet long, and it would win this race. Phil Weld was a huge influence on me. During World War II, as part of Merrill's Marauders in Burma, he had carried a wounded man on his back through machine gun fire and won a medal. Later, when he was 65, he won the single-handed transatlantic race, and I was at the dock to greet him, and he remembered my name. "Oh, Christian," he said, "I owe you a letter." Marvelous fellow, tremendously influential, good pal of my dad's. This is a pretty boat called Barbara Ann, except that every time they got ahead of us, they used to play that song. Martin Pollard, a Bermudian who had the misfortune to sail this race on this rather leaky catamaran. Newport, you gotta love it. After the excitement of the start had died down, we settled into shipboard routine, 4 hours on and 4 hours off, and I think about then I realized that this was going to be my favorite Bermuda race of all time for a very unusual reason. It was very little wind. We drifted. We waited. No motor, don't forget. Couldn't use a motor in a race anyway. It took us 4 or 5 or 6 days to get there, 4 on and 4 off, in a wonderful suspension of time. Jim White was a great crew member. My brother was in good spirits. We were away from the world. 4 hours on and 4 hours off, night and day. Lots of food, plenty of time to prepare. When it's not rough, you can just put things on flat surfaces and leave them there. A full moon, sundown, sunup, swab the deck, look for wind, watch the moon, take your sextant, sights, plot your position, hope for the best. We had no radio contact with shore whatever. Single sideband couldn't reach that far, or at least ours couldn't. And so we just lived. I remember this like it was yesterday, in a kind of calm that descended over all of us. There was nothing to do but do, nothing to be but be. The fish knew what they were doing. The dolphins seemed happy. There were no storms on the horizon, only a steady, slow, intermittent progress toward an island paradise that we'd seen only once before. Well, Jeff, if you really don't like the lunch I made, you can go make your own lunch, man. I mean, what are you talking about? What? Okay, there was no ice, but there were beautiful sunsets. They say you get tired of sunsets and full moons at sea. They say you can't tell whether they're sunsets or sunrises, which may be true since that was just a sunrise. What breakfast shall we make? Remember those flying fish? Well, here they are. In the morning when you woke up, there were flying fish littering the deck. A little bigger than that oftentimes. Collect them, scrape off a few wings, throw them in the frying pan with the eggs. A marvelous, fresh, sushi-like breakfast. And then if it was your watch, 4 hours on. And if it wasn't, lie on the deck and watch the sargasso weed. Trail your hand over the boat and pick up a clump of sargasso. We weren't the only ones alive out there, even though we were 400 miles offshore. In that sargasso weed were tiny creatures that seemed glad to see us. There are certain times at sea when you don't want to eat anything. This wasn't one of them. The water was transparent, a blue that doesn't exist on any palette but that of the far offshore, with the sunlight vertically piercing it. A bit of breeze from behind. Let's get the spinnaker out and up. Let's work it, boys. I wouldn't say driver. Just keep the sail full. Now we've picked up speed. That's the patent log that before electronic instruments we trailed behind us to see how far we'd gone. I think it read 140 then. These boats had a big cockpit. They were very wide, very light. I think it was my favorite race because I felt the most at home. And of course I didn't have to do the navigation, which involved complicated sums. Steer 158. Roger, Captain. 158 it is. My father had taken lots of courses at the Hayden Planetarium in sextants, but hey, there's a whale. That's not a whale, that's a jellyfish. Yo-ho-ho and a bucket of tar. One's first view of the island of Bermuda looks like that. That's Spit, the buoy that tells you you have arrived and avoided the surrounding reefs, which can certainly ruin anyone's day. To the leeward of almost every island, anywhere I've ever been, there's always a nice breeze, so that when you come in the evening time, in Bermuda towards St. David through the cut, it's a different world, a world of azure lagoons and bougainvillea, bridge tenders, mansions. I think being from New Jersey made all the difference. This was as far as you could get from Rahway or Newark. Come on, Jimmer, pump that raft up so we can go ashore. Look, Pram's racing. Once inside the protection of Bermuda, you had to motor for about 20 miles to Hamilton Harbor. A very pretty experience for sea-ravaged yachtsmen who hadn't shaved or had anything cold to drink in a week. Eventually, you wound your way to the head of Hamilton Harbor, past the cruise ships accompanying the traditional yachts, until Mediterranean moored at a place called the Royal Hamilton Amateur Dinghy Club, our hosts. It's hard to imagine a picture, at least in my mind, as perfect as this. The end of the harbor, the boat's moored. Some of the racers have scattered, but we have a favored spot at the dock. And here we are on the veranda, overlooking the harbor, ready, I'm certain, to go inside and have a cold Heineken or a gin and tonic. The gentlemen members only entrance was the front entrance. My mother had to go in the back. She caused quite a ruckus, actually. After you sailed to Bermuda, you had to refit, and that meant, a week or 10 days there. And when we left after this particular trip, it was blowing pretty hard outside, and we felt really good. That boat had come in with a blown-out jib, and I think she'd been stuck on the reef for a day before rescue. But we were used to this sort of thing now, old hands that we were. Why, look, the rudder's come off again. The bloody rudder has come off again after all that money and time and repair. And now we are marooned 300 miles from Bermuda. There's a stainless steel pintle that goes in the gudgeon. My father had it. We turned on our EPIRB, our emergency radio position indicator. And because the Coast Guard had a budget in those days, it wasn't more than a couple of hours before this enormous plane appeared overhead with a tremendous interest in the crew of a private sailing vessel. I was a bit embarrassed myself, but they knew just what they were doing. They commenced to drop these smoke bombs, which I later recognized as lineups for their anti-submarine drill, which they were probably just practicing. This took a long time, all day, through a series of rain squalls. Then they dropped what looked like a bomb on us. We retrieved it. It turned out to be an anti-submarine set of listening devices, microphones on a 50-foot wire, another low pass to make sure we're all right, and if you can believe it, an accurate dropping of a balsa message to us, which read, "Happy 4th of July. We're diverting a tanker toward you for further assistance." A tanker, all right. You know, privately, I still didn't want any assistance. I could have drifted around out there in this nice weather forever, I think. And also, this anti-submarine microphone was full of an orange dye marker that got orange dye all over the boat. All right, by dusk, here comes that plane again, bringing with us an enormous tanker called the Mormon, which almost killed us. It came so close in a blazing rain squall and got about 100 yards away while we were screaming, go away, don't come near us. We'll fix this mess ourselves." Bob Harris's lesson of a couple of years ago came true. He put out a sea anchor to steady the boat. It looks like there wasn't much wind anyway, although at sea every boat has a motion that makes it hard to work on it. We thought our way through the problem just as Harris recommended. We came up with a repair plan. We spent hours and hours and hours in the raft like this, putting our repair plan in action. After all, it was only a rudder. It was only an ocean. It was only a problem. And our solution didn't look entirely professional, but it worked. We amused ourselves by reading Pierce Paul Reed's book Alive, you know, the rugby team that crashed in the Andes and ate each other. We weren't going to eat each other. We had plenty of food left. Well, if the 1973 race was my favorite, this one was certainly not. It was good to see all the old crew again at Newport, this race starting in fog, as they sometimes did. We knew the crew, we knew where we were going, we knew what we were up to. And at the skipper's meeting, there'd been optimistic talk of strong winds, which might help us set a course record, which was, after all, what multi-hulls were all about, sailing fast. We wanted a good wind. We wanted a chance to strut our stuff. Good to have a bottle of wine on board, and my cousin Gregory Williams was part of the crew this time. I recall this very well. The overcast skies say there's a whale. You know, we hit a whale one night, going very fast, a big thump. And once when I was on watch alone, sitting in the cockpit, a whale surfaced right beside me in the darkness and blew a great towering geyser of bad-smelling spray that scared the living daylights out of me. Greg was a good guy. We were a good crew. We felt experienced. Our seasick remedy of hot pepper flakes seemed to be working. And then the wind turned. It clocked or backed until it was right on the nose. And it began to build and build. 20 knots, that's fine. 25 knots, okay. 30 knots, that blows the spume off the top of the waves. And the waves were building in size until they were pretty big. 35 knots. The skies more overcast. The days began to pass more slowly, 4 on and 4 off. Clinging to the boat, trying to sleep. Not looking at each other because we knew, after 2 days of this, going nowhere, a decision was going to have to be made, and my father called a meeting.
You fellas can handle this thing any way that you want to. I'm not going to make any rules.
I'm just saying it's possible.
And I say it's not possible.
I don't understand you people.
12 men with the smell of violent death in their nostrils.
You're a sadist.
12 men turned into 12 clawing animals.
Give them all.
In the end, it was unanimous, of course. We had to turn back. We were making 90-degree tacks. We weren't going anywhere. Couldn't keep the bow up into the wind. We were tuckered out, and the boat had taken a bad pounding. Of course, as soon as you turn around in a boat under these conditions, the enemy becomes your friend, and we started scooting home at 15 or 20 knots down those same seas that had opposed our progress toward Bermuda. But it wasn't a good feeling. That first afternoon, I don't think we spoke 10 words to each other. For the first time in a couple of days, we were able to eat something, sit back without holding on, without clinging to something. It rained like the devil, and it took us a couple of days to get back, and then we had to get on an airplane and fly to Bermuda because our families were already there waiting for us, the triumphant, conquering heroes who were going to sail into Hamilton. We'd rented a great cottage with its own natural swimming pool. And there our families were when we arrived. Suntanned, the little kids laughing, "Hi, Daddy." The water taxi running on time to our little island. Everything as it should be. A family reunited in paradise. That there was something wrong. We'd flown there in an airplane. Something had to change. My father knew what it was. It was going to be a new boat by Richard C. Newick. This one was a 38-foot native class, I think Dick called them. It had more compound curves than Try Me. He called it Let's Go. It had solar panels and all sorts of innovations. We managed to break the daggerboard in half, going fast and hitting a reef, I think. But we had on board the boat builder, Damian McLaughlin, one tough hombre from Cape Cod, who had built this very boat with his own hands. There was nothing that could break that he couldn't fix. Once again, the fleet was more sophisticated than ever, and you could see Dick Newick's design ideas everywhere on the dock. That's his Atlantic Proa, very innovative boat, based directly on a Polynesian concept. And the accommodations for the crew were a manhole cover. You can see the compound lines of these boats, reflecting what seemed to work. There's the designer himself, Newark, surveying his children and giving sage-like advice. Phil Weld had a new boat. As usual, a Newark design, as usual, a giant beauty. You remember Phil Weld from part one in his great boat Gulfstreamer? Well, after that race, he started off transatlantic with his friend and was flipped in the Gulf Stream by a rogue wave. These two guys lived in the upturned hull for almost a week before they were finally rescued. The boat was a total loss, turned up in a Russian freighter on the other side of the Atlantic. Phil came back to Newark and said, "I want a new boat." And he had a name all ready for it, Rogue Wave. This boat's from Guadalupe, reflecting what I suppose is the new international standard of multi-hull racing, which we take for granted today. Also, the class of attractive females seemed to go up a few notches, along with the attractiveness of the boats. This creature is a Newark Val, 31 feet long. Mike Birch sailed her in the single-handed transatlantic race and came in second. The boat who beat him was 73 feet long. You wonder why these boats have bright colors? It's because we learned that if you've been turned upside down in the middle of the ocean, it's much easier to find a yellow hull than a white one. They sailed faster and better on every point of sail. Some of the initial design issues had been resolved. Now we had solar panels and a trickle charger and better radios. What we didn't have was a sliding hatch. To get down below, you just grabbed the top of the cabin house and swung through a hole. Didn't want any breaking seas knocking your hatchway away. We got to Bermuda mighty fast this time. You could see Spitboy in the distance. Always a grand feeling. Waiting our turn to go through Town Cut after some enormous ocean liner came out filled with people waving and taking pictures of these folks on these funny-looking boats. Spitboy. It looks like we entered in a rain squall. This must be St. George's. This must be a celebration. I think this was the race we placed third out of 28 boats, the best we'd ever done. By 1983, a lot of things had changed. For one thing, we were older, we were more experienced. The boats had already made another generation leap toward efficiency, beauty, more curves than ever. Let's Go was now a tried and true competitor. Great racing boat. I was on the Washington Post at that time. My own sailing experience had increased a lot. I'd campaigned my laser. Larry Brody and I had campaigned Soling US 660 for the 1980 Olympics, which were canceled. I'd been in the Saucy. I'd been on Tenacious with Ted Turner when we won the 1979 Fastnet race. But to be back with the family on a fast try, knowing what we were doing now, was always the best. That's Paul, my father's great friend. We'd learned a thing or two that was subtle. These races were 3, 4, 5 days long, but when you looked at the standings afterwards on corrected time, even though you rarely saw another boat on the horizon for the whole race, Some of the finish times were only a few hours apart. And once on corrected time, we beat another boat by 2 minutes. So that changed everything. No slacking off. On night watches, change sails whenever you can. Keep your eye on the compass. Worry about the currents. Keep alert. Don't slack off. Press on, because only a few minutes might separate you from the unseen boat on the horizon. And if they were working and you were sleeping, they would win. There were calms and rain squalls and wonderful runs. I think this boat was more comfortable than the others. When she really got going, when conditions were right, it was extraordinary. Here we are going 11 knots to windward at sea. That's pretty good for any boat. The spray hit the helmsman's face so hard under these conditions that we used to bring up a scuba diving mask just so the helmsman could see the compass. Otherwise, you couldn't keep your eyes open. But it was great fun, and of course, it was what we'd come for. To eat, well, under these conditions, you found a corner, put your back to the wind, held on, and shoveled something into your face, and if it was hot, all the better. Eating out of a frying pan was considered the absolute height of subtlety. Look at the way these boats sailed. With a reef end, blasting along, solar panels trickling. Why, it was almost like water skiing. We're in twin headsails now, probably changed up from a Jenny. We'll change back as soon as the wind dropped a bit. Blasting across the ocean. My only regret is that there had to be an outboard motor that you could see in all the movies. We didn't plow, we skimmed. And she could stand up to rain squalls pretty well. Wouldn't even call the other watch. We can handle this. On Tenacious, we had a crew of 21 and 9-man watches. On this crew, the watch was 2 guys. Get up there and change headsails, Jeff. Hey, okay, man, all right. Meanwhile, you did the kind of let's go dance in the seaway, held on, swayed back and forth in a kind of rhythmic offshore samba. And it's also the way you slept. You crawled into your bunk, grabbed onto something with every appendage, and went to sleep holding on for dear life. I think we had Loran by this point, which made navigating a little easier, although you still needed a bucket to puke in if you went back into the after cabin to work out the sums. Spit Boy. Once inside, you went through Town Cut, where the line goes. You sailed down the side of Bermuda to Grassy Bay, made a nice turn up into Hamilton Harbor, found yourself at the Royal Hamilton Amateur Dinghy Club. But first there was that nice 20-mile trip. We used to gather inside the harbor at St. George's when people had finished, because nobody really had an engine. We'd hook up together for a long tow. That's Damien McLaughlin, who had his own boat now, built with his own hands in his Cape Cod shop. I think those are Comets through the racing dinghies. Our race was over. It was day sailing again. And although I've said it a lot of times, there's nothing like sailing in Bermudian waters. Next to Damien and Heather Kay, a long tack keeping, blasting along just for the fun of it, always racing. We knew we weren't Polynesians just because we had a suntan, but we did feel a kinship with them over the millennia. Like them, we knew there was an island waiting for us somewhere over the horizon, and our job was to get there and get there fast, and get there we did.